Hi, True Avatars! This is episode 15 of your Queer Video Game Podcast, and the first recording of 2025. I am your host, Zoe Wild, a bisexual trans woman. My pronouns are she, her. Joining me this week is a True Avatars regular, Amy-Lynn. Amy-Lynn is a transgender lesbian whose pronouns are she, her. Welcome back, Amy-Lynn. How have you been, girl? How are the holidays?
Thanks for having me so early on in the new calendar year. Holidays were good. I'm sure I'll talk about the, sort of gaming adjacent and gaming directly related stuff in a few minutes. But yeah, pretty good. Thank you.
Well, we won't beat around the bush too much then, because I think we both want to talk about what we've been playing, because I think both of us have actually had time to game. But just for listeners, the format of the show will be the same as it was last year. We'll break the ice with what we've been playing. We'll power our way through the news. And then this week's topics, we actually have two of them. So first up, we're going to talk about the GLAAD report that we mentioned in episode 13. So it's called the State of LGTBQ Inclusion in Video Games. So that's the State of LGTBQ Inclusion in Video Games. I don't even think I said that correctly that time. And then at the end of the episode, we'll set aside 10 to 15 minutes for some Sonic Movie 3 spoiler talk. So we'll talk about like all the stuff at the end of the movie and like what they're going to do with the next movie and stuff like that. So I'll try to throw multiple warnings in the podcast. That way no one gets spoiled if they want to drop out of the episode and come back later, or they just don't want to be spoiled in general. But yeah, so let's jump into what we've been playing. So Amy-Lynn, what have you been playing?
So aside from the, now regular kind of Pokemon mobile things, I have been finally trying out Sonic Dream Team. I've had an iPad for a while now, so I did, resubscribe to at least another month of Apple Arcade because I only got a few sessions in before my trial expired, but it's really fun. All of the praise, I think, is well earned. It's very much a kind of simplified 3D Sonic game, but a really polished one, a really fun, energetic one. Nothing too complicated as far as character types or, skills or things like that. Music is good. Again, nothing amazing, but still really fun. And yeah, I've been enjoying that quite a bit. And then the big one is, as kind of hinted at in past episodes of the podcast, I finally did, or I acquired, thanks to a certain host, partially, or fully, Arcade Spirits, and the sequel/expansion thing. Not too far into Arcade Spirits at this point, but really enjoying what I've played of it so far. Just kind of those early chapters of any visual novel are going to be a little bit slow and awkward and clunky, but despite that, it really does, give a really good first impression. It is, as, discussed on this podcast, both with and without me, a very, I think Akemi is quite experienced with that game and hopefully soon that series, but very inclusive, very queer forward. Very cute, fun. I love the idea of an alternate future where the video game crash of '83 never happened. I wasn't expecting it to be referenced so explicitly in the game in a very tongue-in-cheek kind of way. But yeah, it's been a fun way to spend a couple evening gameplay sessions.
Is queer video game representation better in this alternate future?
That hasn't been explored yet. A lot of the video games that people are playing are dancing, like a DDR spoof, some sort of fighting brawler tactics hybrid where I'm not aware of any of the characters yet, and something that seems like a mix between Mappy and Pac-Man. So there might be, but 80s style arcade games are still sort of big in 2XXX or whatever year it is. I think it might be 2000XX, but anyways, yeah.
It's nice to know that DDR is in every timeline. No, yeah, I'm glad you're playing that, and visual novels aren't always my jam, so this wasn't a game I was planning to pick up, especially with so many other queer games I want to play and talk about on the show. And you and Akemi kind of have it covered, and I have you guys on to kind of sometimes cover some bases that I can't cover myself. So I'm glad you're playing it, and when I have you on in the future, I'd love to hear more about how it's going and when you finish it, what you thought. So
sounds good.
And also I'm excited that you're playing Sonic Dream Team, because I actually my free trial also lapsed before I finished it, but I was playing Sonic Dream Team. I was playing it with the Backbone controller attached to my iPhone. And
cool.
I haven't played a lot of 3D Sonic games, but I was really enjoying it before I was just busy. We ended up going to Japan sometime during the trial period that I had the Apple Arcade trial, which I knew was going to happen anyway. And I was like, no, I could beat this game in 2 months. And I proceeded to play like probably 3 total hours of the game, and then I stopped. But as for me, what I've been playing, as I've been playing a lot, I've been catching up on a lot of gaming. So I did play through Psychroma, which we've talked about on the show multiple times. It's from Rocket Adrift, and they're a local dev. They're from Toronto. And Psychroma was great, but I'm going to save that discussion for a future episode because I would like to talk about it much more in depth. I did try Zoe Straw's, the game that she is working on. It's called Aloft. I described it as sugary in the last episode, but it looks like a Nintendo game if Nintendo made like a Zelda survival game. So it's all these floating islands, and you're supposed to like craft and survive. And I played it on Steam Deck, and actually all these PC games that I'm about to talk about, I played on Steam Deck. So Psychroma I played on Steam Deck, it ran perfectly. Aloft I played, now it's an alpha demo, I think. It had I think at peak it hit 17 frames per second, and that was very rare. So it was very, very stuttery. It was very hard to play. But when it worked, which was actually, to be honest, aside from frame rate, the game did work really well. But it did give me some motion sickness from the low frame rate. So I did stop before I finished the demo. But I liked it enough that I'm going to pick this up when it releases in early access, or at least wait a little into early access to see how the launch went, and then probably pick it up. It seems like a very big game, and I didn't get to try any of the multiplayer aspects, so I'm curious about that too. I also jumped into a game, Amy-Lynn, that you said you were interested in playing, called Kitsune Tails.
Oh, cool.
And first off, I need to set the record straight. I love 3D platformers. I cannot stand 2D platformers. It's not the 2D platformers' fault. It's me. It's just we just don't mesh. We just don't gel. So I've tried to play games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, and they've just never stuck. I find them too difficult. I don't find them as I like the exploration and the freedom that 3D platformers give me. Even the linear ones, I find that there's more freedom than in most 2D platformers. But Kitsune Tails, it's as polished and as wonderful as I'm sure Super Mario World is supposed to be if I could enjoy it.
Oh, cool.
The only thing is, I felt, maybe I'm just bad at 2D platformers, but I felt there was a huge difficulty spike within the first few levels. I only played the first world, and I'm not going to lie, it took me a long time to figure out how to beat the first boss. And once I figured it out, I was like, oh, that was really easy. I must be very bad at this. So, but I do recommend, I know it's coming to Switch at some point, and I think it would be a great game to have on Switch. If you like Super Mario Bros. 3 especially, and also Super Mario World, it is really polished. It's really good. The voice acting is great. There's some really good humor in the game too. In fact, I do have a note about this somewhere that I want to find. One specific line made me laugh.
It's cool to hear that it has voice acting.
Yeah, no, and it has the voice actor from, I said this in another episode and I can't remember who it is, but it's someone famous from like Nier Automata or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was the voice actor who played 2B, I think specifically actually, whose name is escaping me right now. Oh yeah, right. So for Kitsune Tails, I call it Sapphic Mario Sisters 3. It's got a super cute story, super cute art style. I would also describe it as super sugary, like a Mario game. The momentum felt really good to play. Like when I could figure out how the physics worked, because the physics actually work like any Mario game, so don't worry about that. I'm just bad at game. But when it worked, like it felt really cool. When you take damage, instead of becoming smaller, you become like an actual fox. And the momentum in that form felt really good. I almost wanted to take damage so I could play in that form. Because not only was it super cute, but like the momentum just felt great. And here's the joke though. So, she has this like psychic connection with her dad, I think, the main character. And she says she's asking him for help about freeing someone from like an elemental prison. And so her dad's like, oh, finally, he's like, I don't understand lesbian jealousy, but I do understand how to free you from elemental prisons. So I can help with this for once. which I thought was really cute. So I think anyone who likes sapphic stories or just cute, funny jokes or Super Mario Bros. 3 style gameplay, I think you're gonna love this game, and I think it's actually gonna hit really well once it comes to consoles. Because I think it's flown under the radar right now, but I think like if Nintendo would put this in like an indie direct or something like that, I think this would like really pop off. So, and then finally, one other game that I played was Astrobot. I finally finished it. I've been playing it since release, and I played everything. I've beat the whole game. I got the platinum. It's got a really smart trophy progression because basically, if you do everything in the game, you're gonna get all the trophies. It's like all the collectibles, just like 100% the game, and like the game wants you to 100% it. Like everything's hidden in the levels. It tells you what collectibles you're missing, right? So you're trying to free all the bots in each level, and there's like some puzzle pieces to find and some secret levels. And then there's also these things which I think I've talked about before, but it's got like they're not the same as the secret levels that are in the game, but in Super Mario Sunshine, there's levels where it's just like pure platforming. They take away FLUDD. They don't take away any of your powers in these Astrobot levels, but they're called button levels, and they're based on each of the 4 PlayStation buttons. So there's the triangle, there's the square, there's the cross, which is the X, and I don't think I said circle yet. So anyway, there's 4 of each of these button levels, so there's 16 total. And when I beat the last one, I was like, oh great, I'm done all of them. I don't have to worry about it. But then I was like, I just had this sinking feeling that there was gonna be one more level. And of course, as soon as you get all 300 bots and you beat the final boss and you've basically completed everything, then and gotten all the puzzle pieces, like every collectible's unlocked. This like gold statue pops up in the hub world, and you've got to get all 300 bots to help you get there. And then once you're in the level, it's basically like an exam version of all the levels, all the button levels you played before. So it's like 2.5 minutes of just straight platforming. It took me probably 5 or 6 hours of just like, not straight obviously, but like it took me a long time to get through the level. And a couple times I was just like really tired. Like it was like 4 a.m. on New Year's Day. I came home from New Year's Eve party and I was just like, I was so focused. I had so much energy, but the more the night went on, I was like losing steam. But no, and then once you beat that level, that's like, if you've done everything else, that's the last thing stopping you from getting the platinum trophy. And yeah, it felt like an exam, like the final test of like, have you really learned all this game's mechanics? So, and again, it's just pure platforming. So like, you either beat it or you don't, there's no like, you can't cheat it. There's no way to like cheese it, I guess is the word I'm looking for. So anyway, yeah. If anyone with a PS5, I really, really recommend trying out Astrobot. It's like, if you want, there hasn't been like a full-fledged new 3D Mario game since 2017. And if you need to scratch that itch, this is the game. This is Mario Odyssey 2 or whatever you want to call it. It's closer to Mario Galaxy, obviously, but this is the game for you. Okay, let's jump into the news. So there are quite a few headlines, and we're catching up on a bunch of headlines from over the holiday break. So we haven't recorded since December 16th. So this is everything from December 17th to time of recording on Friday night, January 3rd. So the first headline is that Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, says Nintendo is battling rising development costs with creativity. And this comes from Eurogamer. So we know that PlayStation and Xbox devs are taking longer and longer to make games. We've seen this in articles that we've talked about in past episodes. And thus games are getting much more expensive to make and more complicated to make because of that. So, and it's more of a feedback loop with that anyway. So, it seems Nintendo is not, like free of this problem as well. So they're facing this problem as well. And instead of scaling up development the way PlayStation and Xbox have and letting everything just kind of balloon, they're making creative choices that will help keep the cost down. And that doesn't mean like creative ways of like hiding budget. They're making like creative gameplay choices. Like they're focusing on creativity. So Miyamoto said, "It's possible to create appealing products based on intriguing ideas without incurring significant costs. We believe that not all products require large costs. Even in the case of video games with the current technology, it is possible to create fun games with a small number of developers in a short period of time. We believe it is important not to lose sight of this perspective." So, Amy-Lynn, do you have thoughts on this?
I do. I think in general it's really good to hear because I think those like smaller titles, the creativity, the creative new ideas are, some of the most fun things that have come out of Nintendo. Even I'm thinking about some of the smaller 3DS titles, even something like Snipper Clips. Oh no, not Snipper Clips. Swapnote, which, maybe not so much of a game, but more of a communication tool, or games like Dylan's Rolling Western, games that, even like 3D Badge Arcade, games that were, short, even casual experiences, maybe a little bit more so with something like Rolling Western, but, clearly games that didn't take like 5 years to make. My main concern here, though, is that if I'm thinking about, like, in particular ARMS, where everyone who played it was saying like, oh yeah, this is a really fun game. It uses the Joy-Con in an interesting way. It feels fun to play. Oh, the characters are fun. The music's fun. I wish it had a story mode. I wish it had a more robust online gameplay. I wish it had, a little bit, maybe a few more characters. And those are the kind of things that I feel, maybe you want a little bit more time with. Because for, every sure thing that Nintendo makes, like a Mario or a Zelda, or these days like a Splatoon or Animal Crossing, you are going to get a game like ARMS that has such, like, optimism and creativity, but is kind of marred by, a little bit of, like, I guess, an undercurrent of being lackluster in some way. I also think back to, it's weird that it's two punching games, but like a Punch-Out for the Wii, where, that was a much shorter game, a much simpler game, amazing animation, really critically acclaimed, like, oh, this is really cool. It uses the simple NES controls, but it's new and fun, but, there's not much there. Games that are, destined for, if not the bargain bin, I guess being forgotten in time, like Codename Steam or something like that.
Well, I think that the issue too is that Nintendo doesn't price their games like they're AA or single A, like lower budget games.
Yeah.
Like when Nintendo releases a cheap game, I think the lowest in Canadian dollars we've seen is a remaster for Metroid Prime, and that was $50. But everything else they released this year, which was all like lower budget remasters, smaller games. I don't know what the budget for Zelda, the new 2D Zelda was, but that was also like not internal at Nintendo. But like these games were all priced at full price. Like I think the cheapest game this year that released, it was only the one game. It was a remake of Mario versus Donkey Kong, and that was still $65. And for anyone who's not from Canada, a full price game here is 80 Canadian dollars, which is equivalent to like the $60 in the US. So I think like a $15 discount on a game that was probably cost like a third of what Tears of the Kingdom cost to make, and we're paying only $25 more for Tears of the Kingdom. It's really hard for people to like dive into these smaller games, because Nintendo very rarely releases like very small games anymore. Like what would have been on a handheld for like $10-15. Like I think the only game we've gotten this generation that was like that was Kirby's Dream Buffet, which was a $20 game.
Yeah, as far as pricing goes, for sure. Does, like, how long or involved was the Princess Peach showtime?
I'm not sure how long it took to beat, but I don't think it's supposed to be for like young kids, especially young girls. So I don't think it's meant to be a huge game. I think it's probably longer if you're going for all the collectibles. But I feel like I heard somewhere in the ballpark of 10 or maybe 20 hours.
Okay, that's more than I thought. So that's
I can
good
look this
then.
up while you're talking. So.
Another game, or I guess a game series that came to mind that is usually priced slightly lower is the WarioWare game. So we've had two, I guess, sort of recent WarioWare games. I don't think I bought the most recent, but I did buy the second most recent, where you're kind of playing as little chibi versions of the characters in the micro games. And if I remember correctly, that was like, I think maybe $5 or $10 cheaper, but not by much. So it's interesting to hear Nintendo say this, despite the fact that they aren't really making games that they're charging less for. So yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate, because I'd love to see more experimental stuff. And the only ones I can think of are like the free like 99 games, like the F-Zero. Is it F-Zero 99 or is it F-Zero 100? I forget.
It's $99. But yeah, those
Okay.
games are still locked behind a type of paywall. Like they're still locked
Yeah,
behind a
the
subscription.
membership.
So like, I mean, and to be honest too, some of these games lose support after like a few months. Like Super Mario 35, which was insanely popular. Nintendo's like, no, we're gonna take this toy and go home now.
Yeah.
So, oh, and Princess Peach Showtime. Sorry, while I'm looking at it, was 9 for main plus extra, 9 hours, and completionist was 19 hours. So I was pretty close.
That's pretty good.
But it was like a full priced game. So like even though the game was probably not a huge budget game, if anything, it was probably AA, in the range of AA. It's still priced at $80. So like, it's not like a kid that's going to the store with their saved up money from like, I had a paper route when I was a kid, so I would have saved money from that. But like your allowance, for example, you save the $5 or $10 or $15 your parents give you every week for doing chores. You go to the store. Like when I was a kid, for $40, I could go buy the new Pokemon game. And $40 today is still like $60 or $65. But the new Pokemon game with tax and everything is $90. And this year, those games are going to go up again. I'm 100% certain that Nintendo is going to price their games at $90. And it's going to be like almost all of them across the board. And again, when they put out a budget title, again, it's like, yeah, like I think the cheapest we've seen is $50, which is still like a lot. You're not getting your Pokemons and your Zeldas for $40 anymore. So WarioWare is a good example too. I actually didn't think of WarioWare. So, but in the interest of time and getting to the GLAAD report, the next news story comes from VGC. So unpacking dev Witchbeam challenged Nintendo to crack down on cheap fakes on the eShop. So from the article, they said, over the last couple of months, several similarly named and themed unpacking titles have started being sold on Nintendo's online marketplace. They include the likes of Unpacking Deluxe Edition, Unpacking Universe Dreams, Unpacking New Chapter, and Unpacking Chill Music Pack. In late November, Vux brought these product listings to the attention of Unpacking Studio Witchbeam Games and the title's creative director Ren Breyer, who subsequently reported them to Nintendo. Ren Breyer wrote a Blue Sky post saying, "It's been over 2 weeks and these are still on the eShop. Nintendo hasn't responded to any of our reports of these egregious scams, which are using our trademarked game name and purposely tricking Nintendo customers into buying cheap fakes." Now, I have a bunch of thoughts here. First off, Witchbeam Games is not a AAA publisher. They're not like a Nintendo. They're not a Ubisoft. Like, they're not even a Devolver. So, like, they're a small team. Even though they've been very successful and have probably grown with their recent games, they're still like a smaller team. So it really sucks that they're being treated this way by Nintendo. But also, there was last year a Last of Us clone on Nintendo Switch. Like, it was very clear. It was like it was called like The Last of All of Us or something. It had like a ridiculously similar name. Like, it wasn't the same name, but it like had the same cover art with like an older man and like a young girl looking out like on a barren, like overgrown city. And it was like the exact same cover art almost, but mirrored with like off-brand like Joel and Ellie on it. And as soon as it hit the press that this game was there, it was gone from the eShop in like, I want to say like 2 or 3 days. And it's very clear that like Sony leaned on Nintendo to like remove that game, but like Witchbeam does not have the kind of like strength or power to like just, poke Nintendo and say, hey, our game's being ripped off. And it's not even just like an Unpacking ripoff with a different name like Unpacked. Like, they literally are selling a game. Like, Unpacking Chill Music Pack sounds like a music soundtrack to buy as part of a deluxe edition. Like, and Unpacking New Chapter sounds like a sequel. There's like Deluxe Edition, which is crazy to me because it's not even like, that's such a blatant ripoff. Like, even if those games like weren't on the eShop, I would be, if Witchbeam had the power or the funds to do so, they should be taking legal action, because like, it's one thing for Pokemon Company to sue Pal World over like random infringement of patents, but it's like, I think this is a perfect example where Witchbeam should have the absolute authority to go tell this dev to go F themselves, because they're clearly ripping off every part of their game and also scamming customers into thinking these games might be sequels. So anyway, of course, the queer game that's being ripped off is Nintendo doesn't give a crap about it, but The Last of Us, and it's funny too that The Last of Us is also a queer game, but it's clearly not the fact that it's queer that it's that's not working against it or anything. It's just the fact that Sony has the power to tell Nintendo go to fuck themselves and remove the game. So anyway, your thoughts?
Just that kind of like how in the sort of queer activism space, a lot of times people will say, your cishet white male allies have to speak up and support even when sort of no one's watching, so to speak. Similarly, in this case, I really do feel that someone at Sega or Ubisoft or Activision, whatever, needs to, retweet or whatever Nintendo to try to, make them noticed, because unfortunately, Nintendo probably is going to sadly ignore the indie or the smaller studios. And I really wish that, bigger studios that do champion themselves as, supporters of smaller studios or the game industry in general would, stand up for, their more independent compatriots in this way.
So I looked up unpacking on like Wikipedia here just to get some basic information. I actually wanted to know who the publisher was, because that's a good point. Like, someone else speaking up for this small team would be very beneficial. I absolutely think like Sony should have even stepped in and said, like, we protected this queer game from this big studio that we have, but we can also step in and poke Nintendo and say, hey, first off, also I think Nintendo should be doing this too. But as we're going to talk about later, Nintendo, despite having a huge queer fan base, does not have a very queer-friendly eShop and focus behind the scenes. But anyway, so I want to know who the publisher was, because I was like, well, this game had a big publisher. I just can't remember who it is. It's Humble Bundle, which I know has a partnership with Nintendo, because I know Humble Bundle. I'm pretty sure Humble Bundle, their website sells Nintendo codes. I'm pretty sure you can buy, like, maybe not your Marios, but you can buy eShop codes on Humble Bundle. So I'm just going to look this up here. And I know I'm not going to be able to edit out the typing sound while I talk now. So I'm sorry to my listeners who have to hear that this time. But I've been pretty good about cutting it out and only typing when someone else is talking. But I want to see here. What should I search to get some games to come up? Let's just type in Nintendo and see what happens. Oh, you can literally buy Nintendo Switch Sports on here.
Oh, wow.
So, like, they have a straight-up partnership with Nintendo to have first-party games sold on their store. So, what's Humble Bundle doing about this? Like, this actually might be an issue with Humble Bundle. Like, first off, this is an issue with a lot of things. It's not just everything you brought up is still completely valid and 100% true. But also, like, what the fuck, Humble Bundle? Your devs, okay, the game that you published is being, like, doesn't Humble Bundle not... Aren't they also being infringing Humble Bundle by selling these games on the eShop? And what's Humble Bundle doing about it? No, they're sitting on their hands. Like, what are they doing? Anyway, sorry. Your thoughts?
Just on that, I think, isn't Humble owned by IGN? Like, we have a media company that could be making this bigger news too. So yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, it's Ziff Davis, which owns IGN. So actually,
okay,
let's
so
see. Let's keep going down this rabbit hole. Let's see if IGN unpacking eShop. Let's see what comes up if I type this on. Okay, nothing came up with that, because I know it's gonna be impossible to search IGN proper, because their website has, as much as I like some of their reporting and journalism, I don't like their website. It's an absolute mess to navigate. Let's see. News. Here we go. The last news was from 2023. So, what the fuck, IGN? I'm actually a little disappointed in IGN for not reporting on this, because Video Games Chronicle did. I think Nintendo Life did as well, and I know those websites are a little bit smaller than IGN. IGN's like, they have a lot of weight to throw around. So, are they just trying not to piss off Nintendo? Like, is there something behind the scenes we don't know about? Like, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. None of this makes sense. It makes sense in the fact that, like, queer games always get thrown under the rug, thrown under the bus. Nobody cares about them in the same way they care about your Last of Us's and your Horizon Zero Dawns, which are also quear, but clearly they're not being sold on the queerness. Like, right, when those game trailers come out, like, they're not showing Ellie with her girlfriend. They're not showing Aloy with a feminine partner. They're just like, oh, look at this cool action with a badass woman. And then they kind of let the people run amok on the internet with, like, oh, well, Aloy's face isn't super pretty, and Ellie looks too realistic, and her boobs aren't big enough, so we're gonna just analyze this.
These people in the apocalypses have too much dirt on their face.
Yeah. But anyway, we could bitch and moan about this forever, but let's move on to the next story, which is actually a very Amy-Lynn focused story here. So before the movie even came out, before Sonic 3 even actually came out, it was announced that Sonic 4 is coming spring 2027 to theaters. And also, last night actually, Jim Carrey said he was interested in potentially returning for it. He said in an interview with Cinema Today, he said, "I'm definitely open. I'm open to the idea, and generally they come to me with the next idea, and if I go, that sounds fun, then I'll do it. I don't feel locked into anything in life unless it's something that interests me." So, I was thinking we could actually discuss this more in our Sonic 3 spoiler segment, because I assume we're going to speculate about Sonic 4 anyway based on events in the movie. So,
yep, sounds good.
We'll just jump straight into the next article, which is Famitsu. Famitsu did an interview with Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, and the creator of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi. And there was a bunch of juicy little tidbits in this article, actually, but the one I want to talk about is that the Dragon Quest creator, Yuji Horii, says he's never thought about retirement, and he wants to make games for a long time. I thought it was kind of wild that someone can be so dedicated to their craft that retirement isn't even a thought for them, especially as you're approaching like a much older age. You've been making games for like what? I mean, it's got to be like 40 years for Sakaguchi at this point, and probably also Yuji Horii, and also Sakaguchi, because both those franchises debuted. Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest debuted in the mid 80s, I want to say, at the latest, like 86 or 87. So like coming up on 40 years of straight game development, like that's a long time to be working in any industry. So, do you have any thoughts?
Just like similarly, like I'm really I'm heartwarmed by someone saying that they're not thinking about retirement, especially as someone who is sort of in the art world, and I consider myself an artist. And I consider most video games art, if not all of them. So hearing basically a creator saying like, yeah, I don't want to stop creating is amazing. And that's no shame on people who do stop. Like, I worry about Sakurai's hands with the journals and video essays he did about his Smash Ultimate development process, but certainly these people deserve to retire if they feel that they need to for their own health. But if they want to create in whatever way that they can, go for it. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, selfishly, like, I really do want them to keep making games. Like, as long as they're putting out new RPGs or whatever kind of game they want to make, I'll be there. So, I think it's win-win. The developer gets to keep making games, and the fans get to keep playing them. So, but one other little part of the headline of the interview, is that Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi also said the script for his next game is complete, and he thinks he'll get to a good point in about 2 years. So, for anyone who doesn't know, he didn't actually specify if he was doing this under his indie banner, which made Fantasian. Actually, I think Fantasian was also made with Square Enix. But anyway, he has his own company, and he also works with Square Enix. We know he's not working on Final Fantasy, although, to be honest, we don't know that this is not another Final Fantasy. We don't know that it is. We don't know anything, who he's doing the game with. We don't know if it's even a JRPG. Just that the script is done, and we don't even know that it's going to be done in 2 years, just that he'll get to a good point in 2 years. So, selfishly, I'm excited for it, and I hope he gets to keep making games for as long as he wants to. So... And another Amy-Lynn article here from Nintendo Life. Further updates on Deltarune Chapters 3, 4, and 5. So we talked a little bit about this. So some of this is kind of reiterating stuff we already kind of knew that we talked about, and I think episode 13 and 14 maybe, but definitely 14. So Chapter 3 has recently been tested by a professional team on PC, and it's pretty solid now. Only console-related aspects remain, and that came from Toby Fox himself, I believe. And he said he had some impressions from the team who play tested it. He said it was a lot of work trying to test all the subtle details and text differences in the game. On the other hand, it was enjoyable to find these things on your own. As a single criticism, it's a bit inconvenient not being able to save during certain longer portions, but those portions were totally fun and made you excited to see what was going to happen next. In regards to Chapter 4, the first translation pass, quote-unquote, has just been placed into the game, and when it nears completion, the PC testing of this chapter will begin. This will then apparently be followed by console testing for Chapter 3 and 4. And then for Chapter 5, quote, more recent hires, unquote, have been focused on the 5th chapter with progress, quote, steady, unquote. The creation rate is quite solid this time, he says. Many things are in development at once. And then yesterday, because this news that I just said was from just after we recorded the previous episode. So I think it was around December 17th or 18th. But yesterday, January 2nd, Toby Fox also tweeted an image confirming that chapters 3 and 4 are coming this year. So I'll leave it to you, Amy-Lynn.
I really hope that 3, at least for PC, comes February or March. It will be a nice birthday present. But yeah, I think that's exciting. And I think because Toby Fox feels that both of them are coming out this year, I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. I can really see it being sort of a February or March, and then maybe September, October sort of release schedule for 3 and 4. I hope I'm right. I'm really curious about what those long sequences where you can't save are going to be like. I'm wondering if they're going to be kind of boss rush modes or weird mini games. Like really with the Undertale and Deltarune games, like anything is possible. So yeah, it's exciting stuff.
Does Deltarune play like Undertale?
Yes and no. Yeah, sorry, I think that's the best way to put it. Like there still are, vaguely bullet hell / Atari weird movement aspects to the game. But it's a little bit less I guess explicit. Explicit's the wrong word. But yeah, it's similar, but it is different. It doesn't use the exact moral thing. Like, it's not like you can, spare every enemy. Like, it doesn't really, take that approach, but there are still similarities.
Sorry, yeah, just for listeners too, that's why I asked the question. Is like, I've never played Deltarune. In fact, the only thing I know about it is that one of the characters might be transgender. There's a big kerfuffle with a fan theory about, I think, Noelle, because she has antlers. I think that was the reason. But anyway, so that's the only thing I know about Deltarune aside from anything you've told me. So I was just wondering if it was still like an Earthbound-inspired RPG.
It definitely is. Like, that aspect of it, they do with Deltarune. I think they take a little bit more gameplay risks than an Earthbound game or a Mother game, but still definitely has that DNA. For you or maybe listeners who didn't really jive with Undertale, Deltarune, even though it has some shared characters, a few of them at least, you don't need to have played Undertale to play Deltarune. They are for the most part separate.
Does it have sands in it?
Yes, but no. I mean, yes, but like, don't expect anything big.
Fair. Okay. That was like the only, I mean, there were things I liked about Undertale. There were a lot of things I liked about it. There were a lot of things I didn't like. While I was playing Undertale, I built up my expectations too much. I found it difficult towards the end, but I can get past difficulty and blame that on like bad gaming on my part. But there were things I was expected about the ending because I didn't know anything about Undertale. I managed to avoid almost everything about this game, aside from the fact that like Toby Fox also did all the music. He also did the music for Pokemon. So I was like, oh, I'm going to go play this game. And the music is great. But I built up where the ending was going to go. And it's been so long since I even thought about it that I actually don't remember where I thought the ending was going. But I remember being disappointed by like where I thought it was going and it wasn't. I didn't even know you could spare all the enemies going into it because I was like, I did what I thought was trying everything. But I'm also impatient. So maybe I didn't try everything or I thought I did. And then I moved on and I was like, well, I guess I got to kill this person. So, and Pokemon also has like conditioned me to think like, okay, enemies don't really die in Pokemon, right? When you beat them, they shrink down and they go heal and then they come back and then you can battle. Well, you don't actually battle them again, but the lore is that they go back into the wild and they're healthy again, right? There's very rarely death in Pokemon. So my brain didn't even comprehend that I was killing the enemies, just fainting them. And that's my own... I don't play a lot of RPGs, clearly, so if Pokemon was my frame of reference, that's probably my own fault. But I'm curious about Deltarune. Honestly, I think I might try Deltarune out this year if I have time. That's the big caveat. There's a lot of queer games I want to play this year. But I will definitely have you and Devona on to talk about these games as they come out this year. So let's jump into the first segment, shall we? Because I think you were the one who said in one of the last episodes that you wanted to talk about the GLAAD report in more depth, and I do want to do that because I think there's actually a lot more stuff in here than I gave it credit for.
Mm-hmm.
We'll cover some of the things we already talked about, but we're going to cover them in a little bit more depth. We're going to cover some other things related to those points. But anyway, so GLAAD Gaming came out with a report in early 2024. They gathered their own data on the state of LGBTQ inclusion in video games. So the report is broken up into multiple different sections, and we're not going to cover every section, but we'll cover a large chunk of a few of them, and highlights from each of those sections that we've decided to discuss. So the first section was labeled 1 in 5 active gamers, and I'm going to change every time they say LGBTQ here to queer because I will stumble over myself. So, but it is important to note, though, when they say LGBTQ, they literally mean lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer. I think they said queer and not questioning. And I assume they interviewed people who were also asexual. They interviewed people who were intersex. The parts of the acronym they didn't mention, they probably interviewed, but it really seemed like they were only gathering data for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans people. And then maybe a general, if you're queer in other ways, we're going to put them under one umbrella.
And so, the study that they do quote, that I think was from, or looked at data from 1985 to 2005, that study does mention asexual and I think even intersex a little bit as well. So the full, maybe not 2S, but the rest of the 2S LGBTQIA plus spectrum is sort of represented in some way in this entire body. And I do recommend everyone, if you are curious, which I'm guessing most of you are because you're listening to this podcast, go ahead and download that PDF. It is fun as much as sort of an article like this can be fun. Lots of good graphs, lots of good information.
There's like infographics and it's not worded like in a very boring, like almost like a university paper kind of way. It's written so anyone can understand it. And I think that's kind of intentional, is like it's supposed to be accessible, as accessible, like you said, as it can be, and approachable. So like I do recommend reading it too, because like it's just good to know where to see where your fellow gamers, both queer and non-queer, kind of land. And we're going to talk about some of it anyway. So if you don't want to read the PDF, you can listen to this podcast. So 1 in 5 active gamers are queer. So they said 17% of active gamers are queer, up from 10% in 2020, which was the last time they did a study like this. 17% doesn't sound like a lot. It's not even 1 in 5. Although their statements do round up to 1 in 5. They're like almost 1 in 5 to make it sound a little bit better than it is. 17% is not a lot. But it is still good that it's going up. So maybe they just managed to interview more people who were queer who wanted to do this survey. They also said that 70% indicating they are less likely to buy. And I forget, I quoted this directly, so I'm not sure. 70%, I think this is 70% of all people surveyed, but indicate they are less likely to buy from a studio with a history. 70% of that 17% indicated that they are less likely to buy from a studio with a history of mistreating queer workers. So again, I've talked about this on the Game Awards podcast in episode 12. We talked about this in episode 13 and 14, that I tried to highlight developers who were treated queer workers in a good way, or were at least queer inclusive. So that's been a focus of our podcast too. So it's good to know that other gamers care about that sort of thing. And Amy-Lynn, I'll pause at random times if you ever want to feel like jumping in, or if you want to just cut me off and start talking, like feel free, because this is just like a wall of text that I've written here in my show notes. So if there's something you want to add, just like feel free to jump in.
Yeah, nothing super to add at this point, but I do feel that, although 17 seems small, it's probably larger than the general population, right? So
that's fair. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you look at, depending on what studies you read, the general population is probably anywhere from 3 to 10%. I'd imagine the average of 5 to 7 is close to accurate, but regardless, I think, 17 is pretty cool there. Like 1 in 5 is probably more queer than the general population. If you go into any mall, bank, I was going to say Harvey's to really make our podcast local, but, any fast food place, whatever. So I think that's a cool little thing to mention there.
Yeah, and I think the thing that it like jumped 7% in 4 years indicates to me that like that's more people comfortable with saying they're a queer
Yeah.
gamer. So like the number, I think the number has to be higher, and then I'd be very curious to see like why is the proportion of like, let's say 25%. Let's say the next time they do this survey, let's say it's 2028, we find out that 25% of gamers are queer. I'd be very curious to see why it's kind of disproportionate from the general population. Like why are, and I have theories on why there are more queer gamers represented as part of that fraction. But anyway, there's a lot of other stuff to talk about, so we're not going to dwell on that because we have no data either. So.
And I feel that could almost be an entire episode's discussion as well.
I mean, I did make a list of all the stuff I want to talk about this year for future episodes, and like I'm starting to like line up guests, and I'm starting to line up topics, and I'm like starting to look at how the year is shaping up with releases and things like I know there's going to be at least 2 episodes where we talk about Deltarune because they're going to release 2 chapters. I want to talk about that. There's going to be 2 episodes where we talk about maybe I'll make it 1, but there's going to be at least 1 episode where we talk about Bloom and Rage, assuming there's queer characters in that. So like there's going to be an episode on Pokemon Legends ZA when that comes out. So there'll be a Switch 2 reveal episode. There's going to be a Switch 2 launch episode. There's going to be like whatever Switch games we want to talk. Like I'm already like, if we do 1 episode a week, like I feel like all 50 episodes are like 52 episodes are like fully decided already for me. Like I can't even like squeeze other stuff in. So I'm gonna add that to the list of like why are there more queer games. In fact, I'm gonna write it down right now. So if you wanna chat it up for the audience while I write this note down, I'm gonna add that to my list of things I want to talk about.
Yeah, just that, like, regardless if it's video games, board games, tabletop RPGs, even if you look at the specific fandoms of, like, if you look at something like Undertale or Sonic or Pokemon, or even something like Final Fantasy, which is a little bit more mainstream, like, you know, I wonder... And, you know, I have assumptions, obviously, but I wonder how much of, you know, the fandom is queer in some way. You know, I look to places like the local anime convention of Anime North here and how many people are, you know, cosplaying queer characters, how many panels there are about queer topics. I think about the queer and trans visibility at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. You know, the amount of queer developers in especially the indie scene. So I think that there is sort of this, you know, in realms where there is escapism, where there has generally been more acceptance, at least of sexualities and gender identities. Race is a whole other issue, but you know, I think there are going to be higher percentages, which is a very cool thing, and I don't think it's talked quite enough about. It's talked about quite enough. Hopefully that was enough time.
No, I'm done typing. Thank you so much for carrying the team. I think you probably need some Advil after this. So the one thing that's also not talked about enough, and then we did touch on this earlier, but one of the things from this section was that while LGBTQ gamers are more likely to play on Nintendo consoles, they found that the Nintendo Switch store has the lowest percentage of available games that contain queer characters or storylines. So obviously that's not entirely Nintendo's fault, right? So Nintendo only makes, like, let's say they do 12 to 14 games a year. And this year, like in 2024, we saw only like 2 games with queer characters. And one of those is just barely count because Birdo's up for debate, or Birdetta, as she should be called. It depends. It depends if you subscribe to the Japanese canon or the English-speaking canon. But anyway, so the only real queer representation we've had in the series last year was, surprisingly, a trans character in Paper Mario. So that said, though, you'd think that all these, with like a huge percentage of queer gamers on the Nintendo Switch platform, companies would be trying their best to get queer games onto the eShop. But then there's the problem with the fact that, like, it's really hard to get a lot of third-party games and indie games on Nintendo Switch because the Nintendo Switch is famously underpowered. So it's really hard to optimize games, especially recent games that might have more representation, to get these on the... So there's like a whole kerfuffle. It's a whole problem.
Yeah, like I don't necessarily think that Nintendo is the most forward thinking when it comes to LGBT issues to begin
Well,
with.
that said, though,
But
sorry to cut you off, but no, go ahead. Sorry.
but I also don't think it's their fault for all those. Their fault completely. Like, they are an old conservative Japanese company, but I do feel that the difficulty to get on the eShop and things like that are probably maybe bigger factors than Nintendo itself.
So, sorry, the one thing I wanted to point out, though, because Nintendo as a company, at least NCL, so Nintendo Japan is their name is NCL. They're actually very forward thinking with their employees. They will recognize for insurance purposes that if you are, because gay marriage is not legal in Japan. The state does not, the government does not recognize in Japan a partnership between a man and a man or a woman and a woman or a non-binary person and basically anyone, right? Any gender identity. They just don't. It's their marriage in Japan is between a man and a woman. And anyway, but Nintendo, for insurance purposes, they actually do cover unmarried partners and a whole bunch of other things too. I haven't talked about this on the podcast as much, but there was a whole article 1 or 2 years ago about how Nintendo is actually very forward thinking with its employees, super inclusive. So even though Nintendo's games, it doesn't translate to the games necessarily, it does. Nintendo isn't that much, like, in certain ways with their business decisions, obviously, yeah, they're a super, like, classic style conservative company, but, like, not in every way. So I think credit where credit is due, because I think we do need to, like, if anyone from Nintendo, like, were listening to this podcast, I would want them to hear, like, the praise, we should praise them where they should be praised, and we should criticize them where they should be criticized. We shouldn't just blanket say Nintendo's bad at queer representation or queer inclusivity. So anyway, sorry, that's my soapbox. I'm getting off it. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Amy-Lynn, I hand the floor back to you.
Yeah, and I think that, like, things like that are great, and I think that maybe Sega's gotten a little bit more credit than Nintendo has for those kind of actions, and they are really good. Like, both Sega and Nintendo, and I'm sure I'm sure other companies have been making strides like that, especially as the government doesn't. I am curious how many queer employees actually work there. It's great that these are on the books, but I really hope that they're hiring, gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary people as well. Kind of hard to do that, I guess, as easily. Like, less people in Japan are out for myriad of reasons. But here's hoping. And I do. I think I do feel that there's lots of opportunities. There was, implied sapphic romance in Splatoon. I think games like Xenoblade Chronicles have great opportunity to add queer characters in there. So even though I don't think there's going to be a gay, third Mario brother anytime soon, or even like a girlfriend for Zelda or anything like that, I do feel that they do have franchises that they can probably add queer characters without causing too much of a ruckus. Like, even if it's like if they make some sort of future Star Fox RPG and some space couple are running a space inn or a space shop, like, that could be a thing. Yeah, we should probably move on.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking up this what Nintendo actually did say when they came out and said when they came out and said that they do recognize same-sex marriage. They said there was also an issue of gender diversity in their employees. So they said Furukawa specifically called for all employees to adopt a renewed understanding that even speech and actions which are not intended to harm can cause significant emotional pain, asking for understanding and support to create an environment in which everyone can work comfortably. And I do think there was an article at one point saying they were trying to hire more women. So it's a step in the right direction. It's not perfect. They have a long road ahead of them, but this is still better than, like, to be honest, what I've heard about Nintendo America and the Pokemon Company International have really, or was it the Pokemon Company Japan? I think it was Pokemon Company International has a really good trans policy and queer policy for competitive gameplay, but then the Pokemon Company Japan was not so great at it. And then vice versa, Nintendo of America had not such a great policy for queer and same-sex things but Nintendo Japan did. Anyway, it's a whole thing. I tweeted about this like 2.5 years ago. I don't remember, but you're right. We should absolutely move on. I just want to say one last bullet point from this section, because it does speak to something we talked about earlier. LGBTQ gamers spend more time playing across all platforms than non-queer gamers. But anyway, the next section. So, the case for queer inclusion in video games. So, 72% of queer gamers say that seeing characters with their gender identity and or sexual orientation represented well makes them feel better about themselves, and the percentage is even higher for younger age groups. So, 78% of 13 to 17-year-olds. So, representation is important, clearly. 70% of queer gamers and 46% of non-queer gamers are less likely to buy or play a game if it contains harmful tropes or stereotypes about the queer community. There is a desire to see more queer representation, and that desire is highest among younger gamers. Queer gamers care more about being able to play as their own gender, and I'm sure that probably is doubly true for trans people.
Mm-hmm. Believe it or not, that there is a Sonic connection that I can make here, but I will save it. But I think that this is really important, and and it's why that I hope that games like Mario Kart, like Mario Party, and similar games for other platforms continue to have like a wide diversity of characters, whether that's body shapes and sizes, in cases if it's animals, like species. You never know what a kid is going to connect with. And when it comes to older kids into teens and adults, like the ability to see someone represented either in story or even, knowing if it's like a little cutscene or video that the company released that shows, oh yeah, this character has a girlfriend. Oh yeah, he has a husband and a son. Like all these kind of things. Hopefully it's implicit or explicit and in the games, but any sort of representation is good, and I'd love to see that confidence, increase, so that it's very cliche, but representation really does matter, and the more that is out there, the more that even people who are cisgender, heterosexual, can get used to seeing queer people in everyday scenarios, in fantasy scenarios, in fantastic scenarios, in, random music rhythm games, like throw a lesbian in Parappa the Rap of 5, whatever. This is, important, and I hope that all of these stats continue to improve. I know that sounds like a reflection of the entire article, but I got into it there. But yeah.
No, that's great too. But it does make me wonder about, so this is a very specific example, but I'm sure it's not the only example where something like this is the case, but it's definitely the most pointed. So in Hogwarts Legacy, which is famously a very anti-queer franchise, J.K. Rowling has made it very clear that she absolutely loathes the trans population. She says she's all for, the lesbians, the gays, and the bisexuals, but also tweets things that no lesbian, gay person or bisexual would ever say about trans people. And also has never cited any of the times she's actually said, oh, well, a lesbian emailed me and said this, and she's never actually been able to prove that, and not that she should share private emails necessarily, but she's constantly saying that, yeah, lesbians agree with me all the time, behind closed doors or whatever. But when Hogwarts Legacy came out, the developers, I'm pretty sure, were saying, we tried our best to be queer inclusive. I'm not sure if that included behind the scenes or not. And I'm not necessarily remembering correctly if they even said that explicitly, but they did come out and say well, we added a trans character to the game to say, we're trying here. But first off, the trans character is kind of a stereotype, and J.K. Rowling also had creative control over the name, and she picked a name that enough people will understand as being super transphobic, and then other people were definitely a cis-het person might think, oh, you're reading into that too much, or it's clearly not intentional, it just worked out that way, or they might not even notice it at all. But the character's name is Sirona Ryan, right? So her first name is Sirona, and her last name is Ryan, and Ryan can be a name for both men and women, but most notably for men, And also, Sirona, it sounds like Sir Ryan. And I don't think it's any coincidence that that's the name that she picked for a trans woman. So even though the character is voiced by a trans woman, and the devs intended for her to be inclusive, they clearly didn't go far enough, or J.K. Rowling held them back in some way. So even, I'm not sure that the question I'm asking here, and I don't have an answer to it at all. I don't even have thoughts necessarily, but I just want to raise the question of like, even a game that's super, super anti-queer can include someone who there is intended to be inclusive to get someone to like. Is all queer inclusion and queer representation in video games a good thing when it's a game like Hogwarts Legacy, for example?
Well, is it better? Would it have been better if there was none at all? Like that's the tricky thing.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of like, let's say kids are going to be playing that game who have no idea about the controversy. Like maybe, you know, their parents either don't know about it or, you know, are maybe even supporters of J.K. Rowling. And I don't know how kid-friendly this game is, but let's say kids are playing it anyways. Enough kids play, you know, GTA and stuff like that. So if a kid like that is playing and sees a trans character and doesn't pick up on the transphobic name, you know, here's a character that has just been normalized for, you know, a younger person, which, you know, could be a positive thing. It's, you know, I still am on the camp
Counterpoint.
Of... Yeah.
Sorry,
okay, yeah.
sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, actually. I just, while you were talking about that, and I'm cutting Amy-Lynn off more here than I usually do for my guests. I try not to. But counterpoint, though, is that growing up, I saw a lot of negative representation for trans people that, like, I didn't know was supposed to be negative, but I just saw, like, caricatures of trans women in TV shows and cartoons and movies. Or jokes about trans women that I just, as a kid, I internalized. And again, I'm not speaking to if Sirona Ryan is like that bad in terms of representation and being a caricature or not. But like, there is the argument that like kids can internalize like the man in a dress joke, for example, that I assumed all trans women were men in a dress. And the ones that passed really well were so unattainable and so rare, or you had to start at the age of like 3 if you wanted to look like that, that like, you can also internalize bad things that you don't even realize are bad at the time too. And it can delay transition. In my case, it definitely did. So.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Sirona to know how, you know, positive or negative that portrayal was. But I do think that, yeah, a negative portrayal is worse than no portrayal. I will agree with you there.
Well, see, I'm not even saying necessarily one way or the other. I'm just like, I just think these are questions to be asked as like...
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right? Like, you know, it's always good when a studio is actually hiring queer people. And if they're not hiring queer people, they're at least, and we talked about this in a previous episode, they're at least talking to queer people and opening a dialogue about what that representation should look like. And if they're not even doing that, then at least, you know, sending one of their directors down the checkout aisle to ask the trans cashier or the trans Starbucks worker, what the fuck, you know? So...
And there are definitely like occasions or instances where a negative portrayal has been reclaimed. Like, I don't necessarily think Birdo is the most positive portrayal of a trans character in the world, but you know, she is still sort of in some small ways championed as, look, Nintendo has a trans character. Like, you know, most people don't think about Vivian. But I'm also thinking about like Poison, who, I forget what game series Poison's from. Streets of Rage. Anyways, I feel embarrassed about that right now, but
I'm looking the name that
okay,
up
yeah.
right now. Final Fight? Does that sound
Final
right?
Fight, yep, yeah. So with Poison, you know, not a great portrayal, and you know, even the you know, her status as trans is in flux depending on the translation or what the Japanese developer thought at the time or currently. But some people see a character like Poison and find a lot of you know, positivity and empowerment, and some people find a really harmful stereotype. So, you know, even, you know, something like that, it can go either way.
Yeah, at least no one's, so far, I don't think there's any, or at least in the case of Sirona Ryan, for what I have seen of the cutscenes, I could barely watch them because I could barely stomach the thought about enduring anything from J.K. Rowling's brain at this point. But I don't remember her being as bad as, say, Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, who I guess there is some debate from people who watch the movie whether or not Buffalo Bill is actually trans, because Hannibal Lecter says he's not trans, he just thinks he is. But as we all know, thinking you're trans is being trans. So like Hannibal Lecter doesn't get to decide if Buffalo Bill is trans or not. But I don't think Buffalo Bill is representative of trans women in any way. So, but anyway, so I just thought about that when you said reclaiming people, and I was like, well, no one's ever going to reclaim Buffalo Bill. That's for damn sure. But Serena Ryan, maybe. I mean, if J.K. Rowling ever gets off her soapbox about hating people, or you know, ever, if the situation ever changes with J.K. Rowling and things get better, maybe a lot of the stereotypes in Harry Potter, of which there are many, like Serena Ryan is barely the tip of the iceberg for that. I think in the previous episode, Amy, you mentioned Kingsley Shacklebolt. So
yeah, there's a lot worse.
Maybe some of those characters can still be reclaimed. They're not as far gone as, say, Buffalo Bill, but I do want to move on to the next topic here, the next heading. So, opinions on queer main characters. So, research from the queer, it's actually called the LGBTQ Game Archive, which actually I think is really, really cool that there's a whole website about this. I didn't even know it existed until I read this report. So, this is where they got that 1985 to 2005 data from, actually, was the LGBTQ Game Archive. Which found that less than 30% of queer characters were playable between those during those 2 decades. Building on that work, Cody Mayer and Xavier Ho have shown that in the context of all games released between 1985 and 2020, very few video game characters were queer, and those that were queer tended to be cisgender men and white. One transgender man said, "I don't need to have a game have a pro tag, sick, look like me, but I'm more likely to play one that does." So they also said, and this is actually now the GLAAD report, the majority of non-queer gamers are not dissuaded by representation, and queer gamers are much more likely to play a game with representation. Over 60% of non-queer gamers say that it would not make a difference in their decision to buy or play a game. This means that more representation is not harmful, since most non-queer games are indifferent, most non-queer gamers are indifferent, and very few will avoid a game with queer representation. So despite what the loudmouths on social media would have you believe, you know, we hear like, oh, you know, this game is queer friendly, we're not going to play The Last of Us Part 2. There's a very, very vocal minority that really hates The Last of Us Part 2. They claim it's because of, you know, said early game twist, but I think they're really, really, you know, this is just kind of like adding to their rages. They just don't like how queer friendly this game is. And I know I'm like racing right through this, Amy-Lynn, so if you at any point jump in, just cut me off, because I've cut you off a bunch this episode.
No,
for that, I apologize. But of non-queer gamers, 18 to 34-year-olds are least likely to be dissuaded by queer content. Queer gamers are 4 to 5 times more likely than non-queer gamers to buy or play a game because it allows them to play as a queer main character. So like I said before, like this means go woke, go broke is completely untrue, and companies who have recently canceled their queer inclusive content, Disney, are likely to see less return on investment. And this is my own take on this, by the way, this go woke, go broke bit. Since inclusion only helps, but a lack of inclusion clearly hurts. The amount of people that were absolutely disappointed and gutted by the removal of the trans femme character from the Pixar show coming out, it's so sad, because first off, it was like the best trans representation I've ever seen put to film. Ever. Like, the second I saw it, I started crying, and it was like storyboards. Like 2 frames a second of storyboards. And it just like, if I had seen that 10 years ago, my egg would have cracked immediately. It's so, anyway, I know that's a TV show, not necessarily a game, but I do think the election in the US, which supposedly is fueling Disney's anti-queer initiative, I think we're going to see that in some games, and I think this trickle-down effect, this like the delay for games, especially since they take so long, I think we're going to be seeing that for a few years potentially. But anyway, I will let you have the floor.
No, and I feel that like all media is connected there. So I don't feel that, you know, what happened with the Pixar baseball series, or recently with Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, where we had, you know, in the case of Moon Girl, like a very explicit trans episode banned and pulled. That episode was completed. If you dig around, you can find it online.
Yeah, it leaked. They leaked it, and they leaked this, and the Pixar stuff was also leaked because the people working on it were very fucking disappointed.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend our audience to check out both of them, because they are great for, different reasons. The Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur episode is a little bit more, not over the top, but explicit in this is a story about a trans girl who gets, transphobia at her, versus the Pixar one, it's still very clearly a, transphobia, or not even transphobia, but,
It's just
a
trans
trans
experience.
story. Yeah. And it's a little bit more vague. Like, it's still obvious, but it's a little bit more artistic, a little bit less dialogue heavy. It's not talking about the issues with words, but it does so.
Sorry, it's doing the Pixar thing where they show and don't tell.
Yeah, exactly. Which is
beautifully so.
Yeah, it's even in a storyboard, it's done beautifully. Like the big bathroom symbols getting huge. Like, there's great stuff going on there. And, if you think, I've mentioned before with something like Celeste, where, the developer didn't realize, her gender identity while creating the game, but there are still elements in there, that have found their way in. And, I hope that, despite the presidential election and the sort of unfortunate turn of the political tides recently, I hope we get artistic stories in games, in TV and movies and comics. I'm sure it'll be in comics. They're pretty resilient to this sort of thing. But I think video games, especially if we can get like a larger indie game, like I'm thinking along the like popularity scope of a Shovel Knight or a Hollow Knight, not necessarily all Knight related things, but along those levels. Hades is pretty queer already, but I'm thinking, of course, all ages.
I mean, we're talking about Celeste, which is already pretty big. I think if Celeste had like, I know at the time it wasn't made, the developer wasn't out yet, but I think all Celeste needed was a bit of dialogue saying that the character is trans at the beginning, and I think that Celeste would have been that game. Like, it was so close to being that game you're talking about.
And in a lot of ways it still is, even though it's retroactive. I've mentioned already how important inclusion is. But I really hope that developers, since this is a video game podcast, aren't afraid, or even if they are afraid, they do it anyways. When it comes to, these kind of inclusion actions.
Yeah, that was very well put. I really do hope. I hope for the best. I'd be curious I think it might come up in this. I'm not sure if they do talk about the amount of queer content that's actually available in general. I think there might be a bit towards the end. But anyway, let's move through and maybe we'll come back to this because I do want to talk about it. But there were some opinions on optional or secondary queer representation. So I think we'll just blow through this because this is kind of like... It's kind of secondary. It goes with the previous section, but they made it its own section. But 30% of non-queer gamers affirm they'd be less likely to buy or play a game with a transgender main character.
Boo-hoo.
Actually, I lied. This is I mean, specifically, I feel like they're probably more likely to be happy with cis gay characters than transgender characters. We saw the study saw the most resistance among all respondents to transgender representation in games. So it really does seem like right now society's problem is with trans people, and obviously that's been exacerbated by the J.K. Rowlings of the world making trans people like the villain of the day, which is troublesome. But it's just extra adding on to this. Like, if I bet, like, basically what it's saying here, I think, is if like Ellie was trans femme instead of just cis and gay, there might be more issues with that game. People might be even more less likely to play it. And obviously the transgender main character in The Last of Us Part 2 does add fuel to that fire. And that character is, again, secondary, as most trans characters generally are secondary. And the only example I can think of besides Celeste, which was retroactive in a sense, is Tell Me Why, which is a game from Telltale Games. It's basically the spiritual successor to the first Life is Strange. It's free every Pride Month, I'm pretty sure. It's not on Switch, unfortunately. It really should be. I really think Telltale needs to get off their asses and actually support consoles that are not PC and Xbox mainly. Because Tell Me Why needs to be on every platform. If they're really sincere about people playing this game for free and getting access to it, I think they need to get it on PlayStation and Switch. For all I know is it's on PlayStation now, and I'm going to check that actually, but I know it's not on Switch. And if they can get all the Life is Strange games running on Switch, they can get, and I know they didn't I said Telltale earlier. I meant Don't Nod, by the way. If Don't Nod did not do the porting to Switch for the Life is Strange games, Square Enix did, but I think if Square Enix can get those games running, I think Don't Nod can definitely get Tell Me Why running, but Tell Me Why platforms. Let's see if Google understands what I'm asking it. It does. It is still only on Windows and Xbox, so PC and Xbox. So
I do feel that it is really sad that even in the sort of video game realm, it seems like the general, state of, trans femmes are vilified and trans masks are ignored seems to be, sort of alive and well. Because, I think about, the reaction to characters, which a lot of even, the reactions to cis women is trans misogynistic. And I also think about like, how would people react if Kratos turned out to be a trans guy? I know it doesn't necessarily work with the story, but let's reverse the clock a little bit. Or say magic can, help with fertility. What would happen? I think it would just be confusion. I'm sure, 1% would be furious and angry, but I think there'd be a lot of denial and disbelief and, stuff like that versus, if they made Lara Croft or Samus, openly trans femme, there would be riots in the streets. It would be, scary. So it is really sad in a lot of ways that, a trans protagonist is going to cause either confusion and befuddlement or anger versus I think, a lot of, gay protagonists, if it's a gay man, cis gay man, some people will probably ignore it or say, oh, this isn't a big part of the character because I don't think they're going to have a whole lot of romantic or sensual scenes, even if there is a gaming character in a mainstream game. And if it's a lesbian character, she'll just be fetishized. So.
Well, yeah, and since we're also talking about the optional or secondary characters, I think there's retconning a main character. There's a big difference between retconning, let's say, Lara Croft or Kratos into being trans. That would cause one form of an uproar. I think every version of this scenario causes an uproar, by the way, at least from a vocal minority. But there's there's transing a popular character. There's transing a popular character. I use this as a verb. Never do this. But then there's transing a secondary character who's maybe not as important to the story and is in the periphery, so players can kind of quote unquote ignore it. And then there's adding a completely new trans character as a secondary character or even a main character to the story. There's different levels of where people will draw a line, I think. So, and even some trans people will say make new characters, don't change previous characters. So the Life is Strange series is only starting to dabble with trans characters too, because in Life is Strange 3, True Colors, I think the trans character is only mentioned by name a few times. She's in Steph's band, who is never seen but only talked about. Maybe there's a couple pictures, maybe there's a few text messages. I don't think you hear her speak at all in any phone calls or anything like that. But then when they came out with Double Exposure this year, there was a trans femme character played by a trans femme actor front and center. Now she's a supporting character and she is partially a villain, although 90% of peripheral characters in Life is Strange games are kind of, I don't want to say villains, but what's the word, is antagonistic.
Yeah.
So, because they're almost a little bit of a whodunit in that way. But we're only just starting to see trans characters And we'll never really know how Life is Strange really sat with audiences because the game itself was just not a great Life is Strange game, regardless of the representation. So it's not a good litmus test for how people actually felt about a trans side character. Anyway, sorry, you were going to say something.
No, and what you said about, like, I guess changing a character to be trans versus, creating a new character, that has sort of played itself out in just DC Comics alone, where they were thinking about making Superboy Connor Kent a trans girl, and DC squashed that pretty soon after the pitch was made. Versus you have a primarily young adult, although she's appeared in Hawk Girl as well, by Jadzia Axelrod Galaxy, who is the star of a young adult graphic novel, trans feminine character. And then you have another trans woman character, Dreamer, originally from the Supergirl show, but inspired by an earlier character who wasn't trans, but they just made, her descendant or her ancestor, because from the future, trans, and, Dreamer is relatively popular as well. So, yeah, if you try to change something established, people, I think, get more upset than if you do something new. I don't think that's to say you can never do something like that. I think there is, depending on the creator's decision, there is possibilities there. But if we're trying to, I guess, avoid mobs with pitchforks, then we might, I say we, but the creative industries, whether it's gaming, TV, what have you, probably need to, sadly, be somewhat strategic.
Well, you mentioned, I just want to go back because you were talking about retconned superheroes. And we actually did see an example of this, although I would argue it's still half-assed, when Spider-Gwen in the Spider-Verse sequel was made trans femme. But they never actually said that she was. They gave lots of hints. I'm pretty sure they removed a lot of these hints in countries where trans people don't go over super well.
Yeah.
So, like, obviously there's, like, scenes where the trans flag colors are, like, all over the background. It's, like, almost the entire frame besides Spider-Gwen and her dad, but... So there is retconning characters where people are mostly accepting, but also because they don't say it, the people who hate it can just headcanon that away.
Yeah.
But also, they don't say it, and I think that's also a problem, is that, like, sometimes, like, a lot of trans things are, like, never explicitly stated. Even, it can be done for nice artistic reasons. I know in Euphoria, and again, this goes back to TV, because there's more representation in TV than games, I find, but in Euphoria, the word trans, I don't think is uttered until maybe season 2. For Hunter Schafer's character. In the first episode, she's being bullied by the main bully character, and Zendaya pulls her aside and says, and she's kind of giving her the lay of the land because Hunter Schafer is new to the school. But she literally says the word tra, and then the second that word starts to come out of her mouth, Zendaya's like shuts her up and says, like, you don't have to say that, don't say that here. But then later, the person who's been bullying her corners her at his house party and says, like, I know what you are, like at the dog meme, for example. But he's, like, actually, like, threatening her in the kitchen. I think he might even be holding a knife when he says it. He's like, I know what you are. I know who you are. Like, I know what's in your pants kind of thing. So, there's artistic ways to not say that a character is trans, but almost tell us, like, implicitly, like, very implicitly. I think Spider-Verse is bordering on that. You can pretend to care if you don't want it to be there. Whereas Euphoria, it's like the subtext is clearly there. So if you're not going to say it, you got to at least find interesting ways to do it that is still clearly telling us, like, to read between the lines. Anyway, a lot's been said in this podcast. I haven't responded to everything you've said, but let's move on because there's still 3 more sections to go. And then I want to talk about Sonic. So let's go ahead and blow through a couple of these. Gaming provides a social outlet, but harassment remains concerns remain. So this is the next section. Over half of queer games, 52%. I feel like there's a lot of typos. Queer gamers over half of queer gamers feel the gaming community is welcoming to people like them, but 38% sometimes feel like they don't belong. I copy and pasted this from the article, from the report, so I think that's a typo. But it says half of queer games, but I think they mean queer gamers. feel the gaming community is welcoming to people like them, but 38% sometimes feel like they don't belong. In contrast, 59% of non-queer gamers feel welcome, and only 24% sometimes feel like they don't belong. So that's a much bigger ratio, though. I would argue even 24% feeling like they don't belong, and only 59% feeling like they do belong for non-queer gamers is also kind of wild to me. 52% of queer gamers report experiencing harassment while playing online. Duh. Compared to 38% of non-queer gamers. I mean, harassment is just a thing in gaming in general.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'm going to cover the rest of this because I think this kind of speaks for itself. I think everyone who's ever played a video game online has experienced some form of harassment. And if they haven't experienced harassment, it's likely that they might have been the one doing the harassing.
Or you're playing Mario Kart or Splatoon where they limit communication.
Well, so it's funny. I was playing Rocket League when I first came out, and I made it clear. I don't know if I did anything. Oh, I had a trans-colored car. I made my car the color of the trans flag, and I just changed my username to Wild Zoe appeared. So it was clear that I could be female, at least based on my name. And the first time I played a match, and I should note I played without voice chat, all the other team members of the opposite team, all the team members of the opposite team were trying to destroy me. So in Rocket League, you can speed up and blow your enemies up. And my teammates were not helping me. And the only thing that got people to respect me was I scored 3 aerial goals in a row, by the way. So I was carrying the team and destroying the enemy. And then people stopped harassing me after that. They didn't work with me necessarily, but they stopped harassing me. And my teammates worked a little bit better. But even, obviously, Mario Kart and Animal Crossing make it much harder to put that representation on your avatar. But in Rocket League, at the very least, I still experienced harassment, even though, like, all I did was pick some colors and change my username. So, like, whether they thought I was trans or they thought I was femme or they thought I was trans femme, either way, it was some form of transphobia or misogyny. So, sorry, that isn't to take away from your point. I do think there are games where that doesn't come into play and there's no talking, so it does help. But I'm sure if these games like Mario Kart and Animal Crossing had vocal online play, there would definitely still be harassment.
Yeah.
So, the next section. Sorry, I also feel like I've been talking a lot and not letting you speak, so I'm sorry about that. I just have a lot of thoughts and opinions on this too, it turns out. So, the next section, most gamers think the industry has a responsibility to be more inclusive. So, yeah, I'll just read the first bit of this here, I guess, because I think we don't have to discuss this too much, but 50% of non-queer gamers and 65% of queer gamers feel that game developers have a responsibility to make gaming and gaming spaces more inclusive. The 50% of non-queer gamers is, I don't know if that's a good amount or not. What do you think?
Yeah. I think it's good because I'm almost surprised that many care that much. Like, I mean, that's very pessimistic, but
that sounds glass half full to me.
Yeah. Because, like,
I mean, on your opinion, sorry.
Yeah, no, because I feel that the other 50%, like, it's not saying that the other 50 are, completely homophobic, transphobic. They just don't care, which sucks. But, I think that if half of gamers feel that there's a responsibility there, I think that's great.
Yeah, and that's non-queer gamers specifically because they separated the queer gamers and not. So I think, I mean, I don't know. I'm glass half empty. I think that number should be higher. Because, like, this is just talking about general inclusivity. It's not necessarily talking about queer inclusivity. It's just talking about inclusivity in general. And I do think, like, to some extent, certain games don't necessarily need more inclusivity because, like, they're such a blank slate, like, that you can kind of project whatever you want onto them. Like, an Animal Crossing, for example. Maybe Mario Kart less so, because there could be more queer characters in Mario Kart. But also, like, Mario Kart in general, like, it's so everyone friendly that, like, when I play as Mario in a Mario game, I don't experience dysphoria the way I would say playing as a man in Cyberpunk. You know what I mean? That's just one example, though. And our last section, queer video game content is lacking, and I just wrote here, duh. There is more to this, obviously, and this is something I did want to talk about earlier, but so I'll just read this out, but GLAAD counted the number of games that have been tagged as having queer content, and the specific tag is LGBTQ, as of November 2023, from Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, and Steam/PC. So according to Microsoft, there were 146 games available in the Xbox store that had queer content. PlayStation maintained a list that includes 90 games. The Nintendo Switch eShop listed 50 games with the LGBT tag. I'm surprised Nintendo even has a tag for that, to be honest. And now I do want to say that so Steam's tag returned 2,300 games in English, but that number dropped to 1,500 when games with adult-only sexual content were filtered out. And the thing about Steam, too, is that I'm pretty sure not all games that are queer or at least have some kind of queerness about them are always included. Because when I was looking through the tag, because I did actually, after doing the podcast, I didn't realize that tag existed on Steam. Because I was like, it's really hard to find queer games. How do I do that? And I found that there was that tag. And it was, first off, it was hard for me to filter out the adult-only sexual content. Because when you're filtering out adult-only content on Steam, you're also filtering out, like, non-sexual adult content with, like, games with, like, mature themes. At least the way I was, at least on Steam Deck. I did not look on the PC app for this, but on the Steam Deck app, I was having that issue. But also, I'm pretty sure The Last of Us Part 2 did not have the LGBT tag on it, which, I mean, it's not the most important thing for those games. I think both of them did not have it, because the pre-order for, or at least the Steam page for the sequel is up. But if certain games don't have the tag, either for safety reasons or because the developers feel it doesn't need them, or there's so many tags already, why add another, or they just forgot, like, or maybe the developers are queer, but the game is not queer in any overt way. So, like, there are also games that are not being included in that number. So I feel like the Steam number's got to be higher than 2,300, although I don't know if I would count all the sexual games under that number, because I feel like some games are just, like, straight up made for fetishization. So, like, a lesbian game that's just all about lesbian sex, like, I get there's a 50% chance it was made by a man who was just fetishizing lesbians, and there's, like, a chance that obviously a lesbian game developer was like, hey, I wanted to see more porn for the female gaze, for example. And when I say gaze, I mean female gaze looking, not female gaze. Like,
G-A-Z-E.
like, we are female gaze. But anyway, your take, Amy?
No, and I feel that, like, on sort of a reverse level, there might be more queer games on Nintendo platforms that just, they don't get the tag because they're worried that, like, oh, if they have the tag, they won't be sold. Or something like that. Like, I'm not saying it's going to be a bunch, but I can see a few from each of the console platforms not using that tag. Maybe they don't know it exists. Maybe they purposefully don't want to use it. But yeah, I don't think, not a huge surprise on any level.
Now, when I moved my podcast from Spotify to Podbean, and I'm not endorsing Podbean, by the way. I'm not sponsored by them. I'm not even praising the platform because it's not perfect. But when I ported my episodes from Spotify to Podbean, it censored all the queer phrases and words from all my podcast episodes, and I had to go reinsert them after paying for the platform to get the paid features. But I also noticed too that it's basically saying, like, oh, queer content needs to be listed under explicit to avoid some of these filters. And I'm thinking, like, okay, queer content sometimes is inherently sexual, yes, so maybe it should be for adults, although I disagree about sexual content being only for adults. I think younger people need to understand that sexuality is not necessarily a negative thing. If we think violence is okay for kids to see but sex is not, then kids create a part of their brains where they go, oh, violence okay, sex bad, and then we're putting the wrong weight on the wrong things, basically. I'm not saying that 5-year-olds need to be able to watch porn, but I am saying that, like, understanding sexuality from a younger age actually makes you a much more well-rounded person. It gives you a better understanding of sexuality as you grow up and your own body, right? Sex education is a good thing inherently, and I'm tired of pretending that it's not, right? But if queer content on podcast platforms is inherently supposed to be explicit, and I do, to avoid getting filtered out, tag this podcast as explicit, and then doing so, I'm like, well, I also really want to say fuck a bunch of times because I like to swear, so that lets me putting it under the explicit tag means I won't get filtered out for swearing. But I do wonder if, like, some of these platforms inherently consider LGBT content explicit or adult only, and, like, especially a platform for Nintendo that's heavily aimed at kids. I wonder if under the hood Nintendo considers that to be inherently explicit. I'm not sure. I don't have any proof of this, but I am curious if that's why that number on eShop is so low. I'd be curious if unpacking, for example, is listed under that tag. And I don't even know how on Nintendo to search that tag because the eShop is impossible to navigate, so...
And there could even be, as you kind of implied, like hidden tags that aren't even seen by, the consumer. So, yeah, lots of... And, if things like, if queer issues or queer content isn't explicit, it very well could be in the next couple months if what's happening in the U.S. progresses as some people in the U.S. want it to progress and have the power to make it progress. So we'll see how this changes.
Yeah, well, the nice thing about Nintendo, at least, is they're run from Japan, so there's a good chance that, I don't know, at least for Nintendo's sake and maybe Sony, although a lot of Sony's game development is done in the U.S. and a lot of those decisions are made in the U.S. But who knows? Maybe the U.S. is the only place where those changes will be seen, and storefronts outside the U.S. will be unaffected. I hope anyway, because I'm tired of cleaning up. I'm tired of being affected, not cleaning up. I'm tired of being affected by things that are happening in other countries that are specific to those countries that are suddenly now affecting me. For example, like changes to trans laws in England. And the UK, and the US. But anyway, I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard the same thing. They feel the same way, and they're tired of hearing this stuff. So that's our take on the GLAAD report. Amy, before we move on, do you have any final thoughts on the GLAAD report overall?
Just that I think at the end, I think it was in the GLAAD report, if 1 in 5 people or gamers are in the 2S LGBTQIA plus bracket, then ideally 1 in 5 video games should be queer focused. So I agree with that quote, and that would be a really cool future to see.
That would be a really cool future to see. Even cooler if the number of queer gamers does go up to maybe 25% in the next 4 to 5 years. And then that proportion of queer games has to go up too. So, more food on my plate,
Exactly.
So I'm sure you're itching to get to Sonic 3 discussion. I know we've gone way over time on what we said we would do for this podcast. Are you still good to talk about Sonic for a few minutes?
Absolutely.
Amy's like, fucking course I am. What are you on, Zoe? Jesus. Anyway, so... I do want to talk about Sonic 3, and again, I'm going to warn my listeners one more time that this is going to be very, very super spoiler heavy. We are going to talk about, stuff after the credits, and that in itself, I guess, is kind of a spoiler, though I'm sure at this point, if you're into these kinds of movies at all, you know that Marvel has taught you to stay after the credits. So, the last warning to jump out of the podcast before we basically spoil the movie. I'm going to talk a little bit about the box office for this movie, Amy, before I let you kind of just take the lead on this. But so the movie actually made a lot of money at the box office. As we know, there's already a sequel. It's as of January 2nd, it's grossed $234 million worldwide at the box office. Domestically, which is the US, it's beat Mufasa, the CGI Lion King prequel. And it seems on track to make at least as much as Sonic 2 did, which was $405 million worldwide. I'm not sure what the tracking is looking like, what the movie's legs are like, and I know Sonic has great legs, so hopefully the movie has as great legs as Sonic does. But normally I don't talk about sales so much. I don't want to talk about sales data and bog the podcast down, but I do think it means that we're going to see a lot more Sonic movies, a lot more Sonic content on the screen, and I do think it means we're also going to probably see a lot more video game movies, whether for the better or for worse. So there's a sequel confirmed, but before we talk about the sequel, I want to get your general thoughts on the movie, Amy-Lynn, and I'm just going to let you take it away.
All right. So before I begin, I just want to clarify, you haven't seen the movie yet, have you?
No, I have. I saw it.
Oh, you did see it. Okay.
No, cool. I saw it. Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was great. I think every movie has gotten better each time.
Yeah, no,
anyway,
I agree. Yeah. I agree. For those, and I'm not going to do a full summary or anything, but from the trailers and from the soundtrack cues, it was clear that this was going to be at least somewhat a vague echo of an adaptation of Sonic Adventure 2, which is kind of what we got. Very but very clearly in the Sonic movie world. So we're not necessarily dealing with the exact same universe. So the story is a little bit different, but all the same beats happen. You know, Shadow's out for revenge over the death of Maria. In this version, Gerald Robotnik is alive so that Jim Carrey can play against himself as two different characters. And yeah, like general thoughts, I agree with you. I do think it is the best of the three. I do have some soft spots for two. You know, I think, you know, the introduction to Knuckles, that was just really funny and great. And we're kind of used to him now, so that was a little bit less impactful. But, you know, Keanu Reeves' Shadow was fantastic. The way they did adapt and change Gerald and Maria, I think worked for the movie universe.
They didn't shoot her. In the game, they shoot her, right?
Yes, they do. And at all of the Sonic Symphonies, for some reason, everyone started cheering when Maria was shot in that sort of sequence. So thankfully, the death was different. So we didn't have to worry about people cheering when that happened, because a lot of people online in the Sonic community were very worried that people were going to do that and really confuse all the parents that were in the audience. But yeah, Maria had a little bit more agency in this version. They aged her up a little bit, which I think worked again for this movie. All the human characters, so Sonic's parents, I'll just call them, Donut Lord and was it Bagel Lady, they were used less, but they were used really effectively, I thought. Agent Stone, who has become a fan favorite, gets a lot of...
possibly queer.
Yeah, it's very much implied. He gets some nice time to shine. We have Chow references. Like, really, the movie did a great job balancing fan service. We get the Live and Learn song a lot. It, you know, has a nice little bit of Sonic character development. You know, there are some really, like, not plot holes, but, you know, very quick character development of, you know, Shadow basically telling Sonic, oh, you don't want to drive your life by revenge, do you? And Sonic, you know, being all angry and revenge, and then Shadow being like, oh, I guess maybe revenge wasn't so great. There was some weird writing hiccups like here and there, but it didn't really distract too much from the movie. It kind of, you know, you can look at it as a, you know, funny little blip, but yeah, it was a lot of fun. All the characters worked really well. You know, middle dragged a little bit, but yeah, it was still lots of fun.
You know, it's a good movie when Jim Carrey, who I have my thoughts on him as an actor, but he plays this character the way he played all his 90s characters. It was very fun to watch him play against himself in this movie. But in this movie, that wasn't even the best part, and it was already so good. Like, there were so many other good parts, like I said, like gay Agent Stone, Shadow's whole storyline. Like, you barely notice that Keanu is actually voicing Shadow the same way.
Yeah.
You forget that it's Idris Elba playing Knuckles, because at first I was like, Idris Elba playing Knuckles, like, doesn't Knuckles have a very different voice from Idris Elba's voice? But once you hear it and you see it, and you're like, you forget it. You know, like, it just becomes part of, like, that character's identity, and I felt the same way for Keanu Reeves as Shadow. And obviously, Shadow's gonna come back. As we saw in the post-credit scene, he survived. And he survived the big explosion, and it seems like Jim Carrey probably also survived the explosion somehow. But maybe not. We have some theories on, or at least you have some theories on how he could have come back in a sequel. I hope that Keanu Reeves the point I'm trying to make here is I hope that Jim Carrey comes back, and I hope that Keanu Reeves returns to play Shadow the same way that Idris Elba is clearly on board to play Knuckles for as long as possible, and that they're shelling out the money for these very big name actors to come play these CGI characters, because Sonic and Tails are played by career voice actors, as far as I know, right?
More or less. Like, you can argue about Ben Schwartz. He's kind of, I think most mainstream audiences know him more for Parks and Rec rather than his voice acting, but I certainly know him more on the voice acting realm, and, the kind of general comedian realm rather than his on-screen appearances.
That's fair.
And Colleen O'Shaughnessy is definitely more of a voice actor.
Oh yeah, no, isn't Colleen O'Shaughnessy Tails' typical voice actor?
Yeah.
Or am I misunderstanding
No, that's absolutely correct, which I think is amazing, but... I mean, it's sad for her. I don't think she makes a lot of money from these. But yeah. I think I do think it's amazing that like a career voice actor gets, her name on the posters alongside Jim Carrey. Like, that doesn't happen so often. Like, if you look at the Disney Pixar movies, it's all celebrities all the times. Like, even your like Rob Paulsons or Jim Cummings, like they don't get on the marquee. So it's good to see.
Yeah, the only thing I notice about that is that I noticed Tails of all the Sonic, I want to say the hedgehogs, but they're not all hedgehogs. All the Sonic characters, like all the Sonic game characters, the non-human characters, I guess I'll say, of all of them, especially the main three, so Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, I find that since Knuckles has been introduced, and he arrived in the same movie that Tails did technically. They're both properly introduced in the second movie. I find that Tails has a lot less screen time and a lot less of a role and a lot less speaking parts than Knuckles and Shadow do. Maybe I'm imagining that. I haven't actually analyzed the amount of screen time, the amount of lines, the amount of time that lines are said, but I do feel like maybe the fact that I'm feeling that way means maybe Tails gets less screen time because Tails is not played by a celebrity.
I also feel that in this movie, because we add Shadow and we add a second Jim Carrey, the amount of time or space for lines gets reduced drastically. So yeah, I haven't really thought or, counted the seconds either, but I did get that impression a little bit. I think maybe it's a little bit less extreme than you're thinking, but I could be wrong.
That's fair. I mean, it's something to think about, and maybe in future movies, I think the Sonic cast in each movie is definitely taking more of a forefront thing. When I first saw Sonic 1, I was like, okay, they clearly want to adapt the games, but they're clearly worried about, like, they do the thing that almost every adaptation of a game or a comic book that's very focused not on humans does. Thomas the Tank Engine comes to mind because it was one of the first movies I saw as a kid, and I remember thinking, there are too many people in this. I want to see the trains. And as much as I grew up and I love the people scenes too, in the Thomas movie, and I know people have thoughts on Thomas the Magic Railroad, whatever, but it's something I've noticed in movies that I've watched since is that they're like, oh, we've got to get the humans in here so people understand the like to ground the weirdness of it all. Like even Christopher Robin, the Winnie the Pooh live action movie, had a very heavy focus on humans, and it worked, but also it's clear that like there needs to be someone there to kind of be the avatar for the audience. And I was worried that Sonic 2 would be, and Sonic 3 and all these Sonic movies going forward would also be very heavy on humans. But it seems to me more and more they're just transitioning very slowly into like getting rid of the people as much as possible and just letting the Sonic characters do their thing, which is nice to see.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in the post-credit scene? We talked about one where Shadow is still alive, but I want you to tell me about the first post-credit scene, Amy, because, well, yeah.
Yeah. So I will say that I am biased in so many ways, but this is probably my favorite post or mid-credit scene for any movie that I have ever seen. It's also longer than most post-credits or mid-credit scenes tend to be. But in this case, I guess I will quickly summarize it. Sonic is racing his friends and finds himself close to New York, apparently. And, he celebrates his victory, but it seems like the clouds roll in and things get a little bit dark. And he looks around and, things are suspicious, and there's some sort of explosion. Something hits the ground as if fallen from the sky. And the camera, pans, and it's some sort of robotic entity, and sure enough, we see Sonic turn, and it is Metal Sonic. And this is very exciting. Metal Sonic now has some sort of arm cannon, which in some of the comics he's had, but this is actually new for non-comics Metal Sonic. Usually he just has his sort of clawed hands. So Sonic is, cocky and fun-loving as always, and, attacks Metal Sonic, seems to get the jump on him, knocks around his head, makes some sort of crack at being a poor imitation, and he turns around and suddenly some more glowing eyes appear in the forest, and more Metal Sonics walk out and surround Sonic, which is really exciting and really different. The only time we've really had multiple Metal Sonics is in the UK comic, Sonic the Comic, known as the Brotherhood of Metalix. So we haven't had multiple Metal Sonics in a North American or Japanese version of the franchise before. So this is new and exciting, and things don't look good for Sonic until suddenly a pink swirl appears and knocks out a bunch of the Metal Sonics. The camera pans up and we see a cloaked figure sort of pose, grab her hammer, land in sort of a superhero landing. More of the costume is revealed. You see the classic, or at this point modern costume, modern design, gold rings on the wrist, and the hood of the cloak is lowered, and an amazingly designed Amy Rose appears. And yeah, it was amazing. The design for Amy, I'd say, is like better than the pre-design for Tails and Shadow. Like they've confirmed that the Shadow is just a repainted Sonic for the last movie, at the end of Sonic 2. And yeah, I don't know if they've got criticisms over those last two post-credits, but it was really amazing to see her. The hammer has some technical adornments to it. I have so many thoughts, but I figure I will take a quick break to see if you have anything to say about those.
Well, I haven't played a lot of Sonic games, so I don't have as much of an affinity or nostalgia for the characters, but I know that you're a big fan of Amy Rose, and this so I also knew, I saw what the post-credit scenes were before the movie came out, they leaked, and I couldn't help myself. I was like, okay, I'm not as invested in this, so if I was ever going to spoil myself on the post-credit scene, and I had this feeling that I was like, there are like two options for this, especially if Robotnik isn't coming back. I was like, it's either Metal Sonic or Amy Rose. I feel like you've got to introduce a girl, or you got to introduce a new villain. So I was like, okay, I was like reading the summary, and I was like, oh, it's both. So then I was like, oh, Amy hasn't seen the movie yet, and I hadn't either, obviously, but you were going to see it first, and I was like, I'm not going to say anything, but all I could think was like, oh, she's going to be so fucking happy to see this post-credit scene. And then when I was watching it, I was like, even though I wasn't with you watching it, I was like, I could feel your joy the moment she was revealed. Like, I like it when things get revealed for fans that for things I'm not happy about necessarily or excited for.
Oh.
But I feel like peripheral excitement. So I was like, oh yeah, Amy's gonna love this. I bet she was like freaking the fuck out when she saw this scene, especially not knowing it was gonna happen. So I was nice that my suspicions were confirmed that Amy Rose and Metal Sonic were they're both gonna be in it. Even though now, as we know, Dr. Robotnik is probably gonna be back in the next movie because Jim Carrey just keep rolling out the cash for him, and he keeps doing his thing. But yeah, I'm really excited to finally see some like female Sonic character representation.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that's Amy Rose. I hope that these two characters being in the movie, I would like Amy Rose to get a lot of screen time, but I also wish each movie didn't have to be like one new addition every time. Even though each movie is lessening the humans a bit, I would like them to go a little bit more full force into like just the Sonic of it all, like the video games and the comics and the shows, and just like let the weirdness kind of shine through, let them just do their thing. So it'd be nice too if, maybe not Sonic 4, because I want Amy Rose to get her screen time. I want Metal Sonic to like have the spotlight too, or at least share it with Amy Rose. But I do want to see like a movie where they can just drop like 5 or 6 new Sonic characters, and it doesn't have to be like a big thing. Like all the Transformers movies, which are also from Paramount, and I feel are like this decade's version of that kind of adaptation where Paramount's just churning out sequel after sequel. Although in this case they're good movies. But every Transformers movie had like 5 or 6 new robots in it, and it was never like, oh yeah, we're teasing like this one robot, and like, that 20 humans are going to be meeting this new robot. It was like, here's 20 robots, they're all cannon fodder. I don't want the Sonic characters to necessarily be cannon fodder, but it would be cool to see other characters that aren't just like, okay, this is the character that we're introducing in this movie. Get excited. They're going to be the focus. But from a storytelling perspective, that is also really good too. So I'm rambling now. I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's interesting, like, if you look back or listen back to our episode where I kind of predict what a Sonic 4 could be with an Amy Rose and Metal Sonic, I do feel that there could be some similarities. What really makes me excited and happy about what's going on in this mid-credit sequence is that Amy has so much agency. In Sonic CD, where both characters were introduced, the first main like plot scene is Metal Sonic kidnapping Amy, and that's sort of the like call to adventure for Sonic, so to speak. So to have the scene where Amy like beats up a bunch of Metal Sonics is really cool, and a lot of people online are calling for a reversal of the classic Amy dynamic where Sonic is sort of super in love with Amy and Amy is an experienced hero, and I wouldn't be opposed to that. I do kind of hope it's mutual. I think that would be kind of cute, but or it's just, played for laughs, as long as the characters do get some development. I think even that can work. I don't think the Sonic movies necessarily need like a romantic subplot. I think they can stick with kind of flirting and hints. I think that can work just fine. I think there is so much potential, especially with both of these characters' first introduction being a time travel based game with Sonic CD. I could easily see them kind of like how they condensed the Chaos Emerald sort of into the Master Emerald. We could, instead of the time stones, there could just be one time stone. We could have, like, my main thought or predictions at this point is, because the Metal Sonics, everyone's saying how they seem like, not Transformers, Terminators. I've never seen any of the Terminator movies, but I know enough from the zeitgeist to get their basic deal. So I could see it very much be a possibility that Amy is coming from the future to, stop the Metal Sonics from invading and proliferating around the world or taking over. And I think when they were designing this post-credits, kind of like the last one, they thought of what can we do with or without Jim Carrey Robotnik. And I think that because Metal Sonic is almost always Eggman's favorite robot, it's almost like a child to him until he gets a different hologram child in Sonic Frontiers. I could see this very much be a way for some form of Robotnik Jim Carrey to still be in the movie significantly while still making Metal Sonic the main threat, or the multiple Metal Sonics. If Amy is from the future, it'll be interesting to see if they do reference Silver or Blaze, who usually is from another dimension, but in the infamous Sonic 06 was also from the future, so they could do that to lump in a couple more Sonic characters. But even if you have a future, it's a possibility to have a bunch of cameos from other Sonic characters that will get marooned on Earth at some point in the nebulous future. But it doesn't have to be necessarily a complete Sonic or time travel story. There are so many possibilities. I do think that that's probably where they're headed, which also sets up Silver for a post-credits, although I don't know if he'll get quite the reaction that Metal Sonic and Amy did. Yeah, I am so excited. If you have more questions, please feel free to ask. But I do want to say, because I did kind of hint at it earlier in the episode, but, Metal Sonic and Amy are really important to me. Aside from, Amy Rose, sharing part of my first name. They're both of them were I don't want to say instrumental, but they did play a part in my, you know, gender awakening. Not that I noticed, but it was interesting you mentioned that you know, playing as Mario didn't give you as much dysphoria as like if you were playing Kratos or Joel or something, like a obviously realistic man. But for me, like Mario absolutely did. Like
That's fair.
I did not want to play any of these weird mustache people. My go-to was Yoshi and Koopa and Toad. Like any of like the animals, or if all the animals were chosen, I'd go to Peach. Like I was just avoiding the mustache people. When it came to the Sonic racing game, which was for the Game Gear, Sonic Drift, or I had Sonic Drift 2. My two go-to characters were Amy and Metal Sonic. I recently bought like classic Amy and Metal Sonic action figures. And I think that the like with Metal Sonic, he acted almost as a bridge to like almost gender neutrality, like as a safety net, of, you know, this is, you know, it's a robot, it's literally unsexed, like it's you know, it's ambiguous or vague. It's and I found that really appealing as a child, and I didn't know why at the time, but it was kind of an unconscious or subconscious rejection of masculinity. Like, don't get me wrong, I loved playing as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles in all these games. And in Sonic R, I was always disappointed that Amy was stuck in the car. But in the game where
Yeah.
everyone's stuck in a car, Amy and Metal Sonic were my go-to. There was something really special to me about being able to play as Amy, because she was just this mysterious character from a cutscene, aside from that. And yeah, so having both Amy and Metal Sonic in this post credits was amazing for me, because we're never going to get Tikal or Chaos, two other combinations of, you know, androgynous blue and, I mean, Tikal's kind of brown or orange, but, you know, a very obviously femme character. We're never going to get them, so I will take my classic pair just as happily.
I'm so happy that that post credit scene was so special to you for that double reason, and that it was like at the same time, and it feels like magic when something like that happens. It almost feels like it probably felt like the credit scene was made for you,
Yeah, and the
and that's
fact that
super
it was so
special.
good. Thank you. And like I just love that it was good and fun and like exciting too. Like not only were these characters there, but they spent a lot of time on Amy's design. Um, you know, yeah, it was just great.
I hope one day to have the same kind of euphoria watching a Pokemon adaptation that isn't Detective fucking Pikachu. Um, I do want to note one thing though. I didn't have gender dysphoria playing as Mario, but I did have gender euphoria that was unexplained when they finally introduced Toadette. I remember thinking,
Mm.
"Girl, Toad, fuck yeah!" And I didn't know why. I was just like, she's this dorky little Toad clone with pigtails, like, and she's like pink or whatever. But I just remember at the time, I think it was like it must have been Mario Party 5 or 6 when she was introduced, maybe. And I
Oh,
remember having like I remember when she was available to play as, I was like, okay, I'm gonna play as Toadette for sure.
Toadette
Um,
was first introduced in Double Dash.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so Mario Kart. So even better is it's always the racing game that has the female character that we want to drive as.
Yeah,
I guess that makes sense because she had to be a pair for Toad, right?
yeah,
The same way
exactly.
Waluigi was introduced as like a pair for Wario in Mario Tennis. We are now at the longest the podcast has ever been at. We've hit the 2 hour mark. I think we should wrap it up just because
Yeah,
it's been a while, and it's 10:45 p.m. where we are.
yeah.
So, but I'm sure Sonic's gonna come up multiple times throughout this year because I have this feeling that Sonic Dream Team is gonna come to consoles when the Switch 2 is announced, or at least I'm hopeful that it will, because I would like to play it properly and not on my phone. But also we know that Sonic is an annual franchise, and not only are we gonna hear news about the movie, which is gonna be fast tracked, I'm sure, but also that they're making a new Sonic racing game. Which I'm excited for because I love racing games, and I like the concept that they're going to do something a little more crossovery with it. You mentioned the possibility that they could bring the classic, modern, and maybe even movie Sonics all together. but also that they might do the Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart of it all, where maybe you're jumping actually literally through different dimensions as you race, which I think would be freaking cool. So anyway, all that is to say, I think we're going to be talking about Sonic a lot more this year. And anytime we do, I'm going to have you on because I know how much joy it brings you, and I like to hear from you. So thank you for joining me this week, and thank you for sharing all your euphoria on the Sonic, the Amy Rose and Metal Sonic post-credit scene.
Thanks for having me.
So, thanks for joining me for another episode of True Avatars, a queer video game podcast. If you've made it this far into the episode, which is really far this time, I really appreciate you taking the time to support queer-made content, because it's a very big deal. It's so much fun working to bring this podcast to you. I always do my best to bring queer voices on every week to discuss what's relevant in video games. The podcast now has a bunch of social media pages. You can find the show on Instagram under True Avatars, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube under the handle @TrueAvatars, all one word. That's Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube @TrueAvatars. We also have a Facebook page, which can be found by searching True Avatars, a queer video game podcast. There is also a webpage in the works at some point in the future when I have time between working, playing video games, and also working on the podcast itself. And also because of the lack of time that I have, my partner and I are working to bring some actual content, proper, constant content to the social media platforms. But right now I've barely posted anything except for the weekly episodes. But please go give the podcast pages a like or a follow or a subscription on any of the pages. Also, if you could leave the podcast a review or a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from, it would be really helpful. Or even come and find me on social media and leave me a comment. If you're listening, I would love to hear from you. I had one listener reach out and say, oh, I'd love to hear you talk about this game in the future. And unfortunately, we still haven't actually talked about JJ Macfield. I do want to talk about it. It's on my list of queer games. I have a long list of queer games I need to play because I only have so much time, unfortunately. But I do want to talk about that game. But again, like I said, this gets into my next point. If you or anyone you know is queer and involved with video games in some way, please don't be shy. I'm really kind, I promise, and I would love to hear from more queer voices in video games. Your voice is unique, and it's valid, and it's worth sharing with the world. And if you don't want to be on the show or know anyone who's interested, and this is where my previous point comes in, but you know about a cool queer video game or a games industry story that's queer related, please let me know. You can also reach out through the show's official email, which is trueavatars.podcast@gmail.com. That's trueavatars.podcast@gmail.com. You can also feel free to reach out via the aforementioned social media pages, as I mentioned. Things are tough out there, and queer people need to stick together when we can. So bye, True Avatars. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to speaking with you all again next week. Take care and stay safe.